Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our bi-monthly webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about outdoor and indoor heat hazards. My name is Kelly Humber. I'm with the WisCon program at the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A part of the Zoom. And we have two colleagues who are going to be monitoring that to help answer some of those questions at the end. But we're going to go ahead, dive in and get started. So our objectives for today are really to cover what heat stress is. So the factors that lead to the likelihood of introducing a heat-related illness, and then the health impacts that it can have on the body. As well as we are going to cover how do we prevent heat stress, so things like the OSHA National Emphasis Program that exists, as well as the importance of creating a heat illness prevention plan for your organization if you haven't done so already. And then if we have time available at the end, there are some case studies that came out 2 or 3 weeks ago from OSHA that we're going to try to talk about just briefly before we wrap up. So, some definitions just to kind of get us in the mindset of what we're going to be talking about today. So, heat stress is defined as the sum of environmental and metabolic heat loads on an individual minus the heat loss to the environment, primarily through evaporation. Heat strain, on the other hand, is the overall physiological response resulting from heat stress. We're not going to go through all of these, but I think it's a really good snapshot to think about as we move throughout the presentation of where we are seeing workers most at risk, to just really prepare us in understanding why, one, this national emphasis program came out in regards to heat-related illness, but also why we should care. And we know that heat-related fatalities are on the rise, and mostly this is due to our ever-changing climate. We'll talk about a little bit in the presentation is 19 out of the last 20 summers have been the hottest on record. And what we've seen in our own environment around us recently is how hot it's been, the changes in weather that we've experienced, and we really want to talk about how that impacts individuals. So this is just a snapshot of what workers were doing when there ended up being a heat-related fatality. So some that you can see: general construction, mail carrying, working road construction, road workers, cutting down trees, roofing repair, agricultural work, as well as masonry work. So just something to think about as we move through the different type of workers that can be impacted by heat-related illness and fatalities. So there are four environmental factors that we tend to think about when we are talking about heat. That is temperature, so ambient air temperature; humidity, so the amount of moisture in the air; radiant heat, such as from a sun or a furnace. This can also be in a hot work environment, so a foundry, bakeries, other sources of heat that we want to take into account of our environment, as well as air velocity. So the air circulation that's happening, is it stagnant? Is there good airflow and movement? These are all factors we want to consider when we're approaching kind of what heat looks like in our environment, but also something we'll think about when we start talking about control measures as well. Additionally, we need to think about causal factors. So this includes things like age, weight, and degree of physical fitness, as well as the degree of acclimatization and metabolism. Are individuals using drugs or alcohol? And then a variety of medical conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, other things that can affect an individual's sensitivity to heat. Additionally, some of these causal factors can actually, predispose individuals to heat-related illness if you have a prior heat-related injury. So if you've had a heat rash before, or you've had fainting due to heat exposure previously, heat exhaustion. Having a previous heat-related injury does put you at an increased to developing heat-related illness in the future. Other factors that can impact include the type of clothing that someone is wearing, the type of activities being performed, and then the environment the worker is in. This heat index map is one that is provided by NIOSH. And I just want to note that it kind of talks about when we want to start thinking about one, the heat index, two, the risk level, and then protective measures. But I think the one thing that's really important to mention here is that less than 91 degrees Fahrenheit is when we want to use caution and use those basic heat safety prevention strategies and planning strategies that we'll talk about in a little bit. But one thing to note is that the Ocean National Emphasis Program is really saying any day above 80 degrees for that heat index when we're looking at relative humidity and heat. Between that 80 and 91 is when we really need to start having those conversations and being aware that things can take a turn rather quickly. We don't always have to be in the 91 to 103 to have heat related illness, especially here in the Midwest when we're not necessarily prone to having multiple days in the 90s or 100. Sometimes days in the 80s can result in heat related illness as well. So we'll talk about some factors moving forward, but just things to keep in mind is I don't want to say, less than 91. What we're really looking at is when we start to see that change in the weather pattern. For a week when we're looking at it, we still need to use caution. We still need a plan, really between kind of that 80 that's recommended coming out from OSHA, and that 91, less than 91. So that's kind of the area that we're looking at for that lower caution. So, what is considered a perfect storm for heat stress? So, a perfect storm for heat stress is when we're working with workers who are wearing dark, heavy, maybe tight wool, nylon, or polyester clothing for their job, potentially working in direct sunlight, or potentially working in an environment, an indoor environment where maybe they're by ovens or kilns, things like that, where they're exposed to that direct heat. There's no water being provided or not adequate water being provided, heavy physical work, so maybe outdoor work using an axe or a shovel, high heat index. So it can be, up into the 100s, but it can also be lower, especially again, as we mentioned in the Midwest. We're not necessarily acclimatized as some individuals who are in the southern states and used to the heat on a regular basis. Not being able to take breaks, not wearing proper head protection on those hot, sunny days, working a long day. So maybe not an 8-hour day, but a 10 or 12-hour day, working multiple days in a row with overtime. And then again, workers not being acclimatized to the environment that they're working in. In thinking about those things and kind of that perfect storm, what can happen is when we're not prepared or we're not given the right tools to be successful in those heat environments, is we can develop a variety of heat related disorders or health effects. And those are broken down into 5 main categories. So we have heat rash, heat cramps, heat syncope or fainting, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. We're going to drop some links in the chat throughout, so you can go to the CDC's page with NIOSH to look up some of that. OSHA also has really good relevant information, but we'll drop those links in the chat so you can have access to them. So starting out with heat rash, this is what we most commonly see when we're starting out in those environments. And the symptoms of this traditionally include red clusters of pimples or bumps, blisters that you see usually on the neck, upper chest, groin, under breasts, and in elbow creases. Extensive areas of skin that do not sweat on heat exposure, but present with kind of this goose flesh appearance that does subside in cool environments. So those are the symptoms we're really looking for. And to prevent this, we really want to make sure we're wearing breathable clothing, and really cleansing the skin when possible. We also want to work in cooler or less humid work environments if that's something we can make happen, or take adequate time to cool down. To treat this, we want to keep that rash area dry, so powder can be applied to help increase comfort. Things we don't want to do, though, we don't want to use ointments or creams, as that they can impair cooling, and they do create a warm and moist skin, which can actually make the rash worse. When it comes to heat cramps, this is kind of the second one in that we often see, and this may result after excessive water loss. So this is going to be our sweating that results in dehydration. And sweating decreases the body's salt and moisture levels, and that low salt level is what results in that muscle cramping. So what we're looking for symptoms here is we're looking for shriveled skin, sunken eyes, dry mouth and tongue. This people will also report severe pain in cramps in the legs or abdomen. Sometimes individuals also experience fainting or dizziness, weakness, profuse sweating, as well as will report headaches. So, treatment for this again, we want to increase those fluids, provide rest, and move that individual to a cool place. Heat syncope or fainting is an episode of dizziness that usually occurs when standing for too long or standing up suddenly after sitting or laying down. Factors that can contribute to this include dehydration and that lack of acclimatization that we've talked about. Again, symptoms of this include that fainting, dizziness, or lightheadedness after standing or suddenly rising from a sitting or laying position. And what to do if someone gets up and they feel really lightheaded suddenly, we want to slowly sit them down or lay them down again, really focusing on providing a cool place, a shaded place. If they start to express that they're feeling faint or dizzy, we also want to include drinking some water, potential electrolytes to help replenish the system. Heat exhaustion is where we have blood that's moving towards our outer body to help remove heat. So, what ends up happening is the blood pools in the skin, leaving less for the brain. Symptoms for this include fatigue, headache, dizziness, profuse sweating or wet skin, rapid pulse, so your heart's beating really, really fast, excessive thirst, elevated body temperature, loss of appetite, potentially irritability, nausea, vomiting, decreased urine output or change in urine color, as well as fainting. And the big warning is at any point, if you feel faint, if you feel confused, or you're throwing up from potential heat exposure, you need to get help and you need to get help fast. One thing to note when moving through heat related illnesses is you do not have to have one to get the other. So you don't have to start with a heat rash in order to get heat exhaustion. Again, if you've been predisposed before because you've had a heat rash before, or you've suffered from heat exhaustion previously, you're more likely to develop a more severe response in the future. It doesn't always happen that way, but just know you don't have to go through stage one to get to, potentially heat exhaustion. So that's why it's really good to just be able to self monitor or monitor coworkers. And if you start to feel a certain way, talk to someone and get that help that you need. Treatment for heat exhaustion, again, the common thread you're going to see is, water, shade, and rest. And there is a reason for that, but we want to get shade, cool off, increase fluids. You can use cool, wet towels or ice, get a fan. At this point, we want to elevate those legs above the heart, loosen any tight clothing. We don't want to give liquids that contain like alcohol or caffeine, but really focus either on like electrolyte drinks or just regular water. If conditions worsen, we need to seek medical attention immediately because things can progress pretty quickly from heat exhaustion to heat stroke. Additionally, confusion may prevent that person from understanding the severity of their condition. So we often say coworkers know each other best, especially if you're working closely with one another. If you start seeing someone acting different or not themselves, check in with that person. And if you note that, talk to a supervisor, say, hey, something's going on. But that's something we really want to relay to either managers or supervisors, to our employees as a whole, that if you see something, if someone's acting out of character, you really need to say something, especially on these really these flagged heat index days of 80 degrees or more. And if left untreated, as I just mentioned, heat exhaustion can lead to heat stroke. Heat stroke is going to be the most serious heat related illness. This occurs when the body can no longer control its temperature. This is when the body's temperature rises rapidly, sweating mechanisms fail due to that high heat and humidity, and the body is unable to cool itself down. When heat stroke occurs, the body temperature can rise to 106 degrees Fahrenheit or higher within 10 to 15 minutes, and heat stroke can cause permanent disability or death. Symptoms include skin being hot to the touch, dry, flushed. Again, we have a rapid pulse, confusion, nausea, potential seizures or convulsions, and that abnormally high body temperature, as well as unconsciousness. Treatment for this while we're waiting for medical attention or 911 to respond in these types of situations is we want to move that person to a cooler location, loosen that clothing. We want to try to get them to cool water, wrap them in wet sheets to help try to cool the body down, applied cold compresses, again, to help reduce that body temperature. This is just an example of some of the free printouts or pieces of information that are out there. This one came from OSHA. They have a variety of PDFs that you can place around the workplace. This is just one of them. It talks about heat exhaustion versus heat stroke, and then what to watch out for. These are really good to place if you are a local tribal health department and you have agricultural workers or individuals that you serve in that community, making sure that they're posting posters like this. I know the DNR also sends stuff out, but posting things like this that make individuals aware what they should be looking for. If you are a supervisor or a manager for another type of business or establishment, again, putting these out regularly just to bring awareness of, hey, we need to prepare for this, or it's something to look out for. It's always a good reminder to have these types of handouts or things posted. This is one of the tools that our team came up with. It's really kind of a breakdown that we have. We're going to be uploading this recorded presentation to YouTube, and we'll include a link for a PDF version of this that you can use our post. So that just talks about the type of heat-related illnesses and then prevention, symptoms, and treatment. This is a really quick, useful tool when kind of talking out the different types of heat-related illness and then in breaking it down a little bit further. So this could even be used by yourselves as a training aid when you're training employees or community members. So next, we're kind of changing lenses and talking about that heat stress prevention. And section is really going to focus on talking about the importance of creating a heat illness prevention program, as well as the OSHA National Emphasis Program that is currently ongoing. So first for the NEP, so this National Emphasis Program. So this National Emphasis Program is an enforcement mechanism that is proactively inspecting workplaces for heat-related hazards. This NEP encourages employers to protect workers from heat by providing access to water, rest, and sorry, typo there, not shade, that is on me, as well as training and then implementing acclimatization procedures. So what is this NEP on heat? As I mentioned previously, we're thinking about 80 degrees. So this is basically establishing that on heat priority days when the heat index is expected to be 80 degrees or greater, compliance assistance officers are going to be targeting high risk industries that could potentially have workers in compromised positions. This is going to allow for continued inspection on any alleged heat-related fatality or catastrophe, as well as complaint or referrals, regardless if the worksite falls within a targeted industry. And why do we have this NEP on heat? Or what is this NEP on heat? So this is going to be programmed, pre-planned inspections in targeted high-risk industries on any day, again, that National Weather Service has announced that heat warning or advisory for in a local area. Again, those heat priority days are going to be above 80 degrees. And this is when OSHA staff will engage in proactive outreach, as well as technical and compliance assistance to keep workers safe on the job. The NEP is targeting over 70 high-risk industries, and this is based off the Bureau of Labor Statistics data on incidence rates of heat-related illness and the number of employees who had days away from work, as well as elevated numbers of fatalities or hospitalizations reported by employers to OSHA. And this will also generate the highest number of heat-related general duty clause violations, as well as hazard alert letters that will be issued over a 5-year period that started in 2022. So we are already 3 years into this. We have another year to go, but it will be looking at inspections. And since the launch of this back on April 8th of 2022, nearly 5,000 federal inspections have been conducted related to heat. So why is this necessary? Well, we know that extreme heat increases each year due to the continuing effects of climate change. So as I mentioned, 19 out of the last 20 summers were the hottest ones on record. Workers suffer over 3,500 injuries and illnesses related to heat each year, and those are just the ones that are being reported. A lot of times, this is something that does go underreported, or maybe workers just feel sick or something else, or they don't know who to report to, or we know that workers are also scared to report things. We also know that heat-related illness can disproportionately affect low-wage workers or individuals of color who disproportionately make up the population of employees exposed to high levels of heat, thus intensifying socioeconomic and racial inequalities that exist. But ultimately, why do we want to prevent these heat illnesses? Heat illness can be a matter of life and death, and we know that. Workers die from heat stroke every summer, and every death is preventable. Heat stroke doesn't necessarily kill immediately, but it can shut down major bodily organs, causing acute heart, liver, kidney, and muscle damage, as well as nervous system problems and blood disorders. Having a serious injury or death occur at work affects everyone on the work site, as well as the families of those who have had to care for injured workers or who have lost a loved one due to heat related illness. As well, workers suffering from heat exhaustion are at a greater risk for accidents since they are less alert and aware of potential surroundings on a job site or in a work environment. So what is the time frame? As I mentioned, this NEP is currently in effect. It took effect April 8th of 2022. This remains in effect for 3 years unless it is canceled, and it can be extended by a superseding directive. So currently, one of the things that is actively being worked on is a, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the dog in the background, so sorry about that. Um, they are currently working on proposing a rule for a permanent standard for heat stress. So hopefully we see that come to be in the near future once this national emphasis program is up next year. But it is something that is in effect this summer and something we need to be aware of. Now we're going to switch lenses now that we know that there is this national emphasis program that does exist. We understand that these heat-related illnesses can be very severe. We want to be able to prepare our employees, but also prepare our managers, supervisors, or community members on how to respond and be prepped for these situations. And we do this by creating a heat illness prevention plan or program. And this relies on us designating someone to oversee the program, working with them to help identify hazards in the workplace, implementing engineering controls, as well as implementing administrative controls. So when it comes to designating a person, we need to identify someone to oversee that heat illness prevention program. And this person must be trained in identifying hazards. So maybe this is someone who already does job hazard analysis for your organization, or potentially if you work for a local tribal health department or another government agency, this is someone who's going to go out and work with community members to identify this. As well as we want to make sure that they're trained in understanding physiological responses to heat, understanding and implementing the controls in the workplace and that they have the authority to do so, but also management of overseeing the program. When it comes to hazard identification, for recognizing those heat hazards that exist and the risk of heat illness, we need that individual who is selected to be in charge of this program to be able to identify high temperature. So what we're looking at is when the National um, Weather Service issues high heat advisories locally, we're going to be paying attention to that. We're going to be considering things like humidity, if there's shade, sun, other thermal exposures that exist, as well as understanding work demands that exist in the workplace. So, are we outside? Are we doing a ton of physical labor? What does that look like? Can we swap people out for different shifts to do different things, start a little bit later? As well as clothing or PPE that they're going to be wearing. Is this going to be able to wear lightweight clothing, or do you have to wear PPE that may place an increased physiological burden on the body? And then also personal risk factors. So things we talked about earlier include age, weight, physical fitness. If you've had or been pre-exposed to a heat-related illness prior, or if you have underlying health conditions that can increase your risk. The individual who will be working on this program also needs to understand um, that a job hazard analysis should be performed to identify kind of areas that have those higher risks or are of concern. We also want to consider using identification tools such as OSHA's heat smartphone app that is free to download. So that's something you can consider doing, as well as the OSHA heat stress calculator. It can tell you kind of where you are at in your environment and when you want to start prepping to do different things or what that risk can be. You can also consider using a wet bulb globe thermometer. Uh, this can be a little finicky, but if you have consultation you're already working with, this is something that you can use to consider temperature, humidity, wind speed, sun, and in cloud cover. And then the easiest way, I think, to monitor when we're looking at identifying if it's going to be potentially a risky day is using that National Weather Service heat index. So again, that exposure to sun can also increase that heat index value by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So a lot of times you'll see feels like temperatures associated with what's going on, and that's really looking at that heat index, that humidity, to determine what that feels like value really is. Additionally, that individual who's going to be in charge of that program wants to work through the hierarchy of controls and understand them, really focusing on the engineering, administrative, and PPE. Um, we know that, unfortunately, I think we all wish we could eliminate the increase in the climate rising, but that's not something we can necessarily do alone. So, and sometimes job substitution can happen where you're working indoors versus outdoors, maybe changing schedules a little bit. But again, we can't necessarily replace that hazard. So when it comes to engineering controls, things that we're really thinking about, ventilation is going to be a big one. So if it is a hot indoor environment, for our local tribal health departments, this could be, there are times you potentially have to go to respond to someone's home to do some sort of welfare checks, or your sanitarians are going out. Not all these places are air conditioned. Sometimes you have to go into crawl spaces to assess situations. There's not going to be ventilation. So maybe reschedule things to a day where it's going to be cooler, but understand that indoor conditions can pose that threat. And then if you also have individuals working outside, right? There's not much we can do in terms of ventilation, but adding fans to direct airflow. So in those situations, we want to focus on things like air treatment. So if we can allow for some air cooling, that's great. If we have air conditioning, that's great as well. Potentially on breaks, if it is a hot environment, let workers go sit in an air conditioned vehicle. Maybe consider adding break rooms that are air conditioned, allowing individuals to be able to cool off that way. Other controls for engineering include um, we're looking at radiant heat sources, trying to shield those as best as you can, allowing for insulation or surface modification, and then also understanding kind of the heat conduction in those areas, or if there's other cooling effects that can be added um, to lower that risk, or convection, pulling that air outside um, in it in those different environments. As far as work practice controls, things that we want to consider is uh, when to perform different work activities. So we want to try during cooler periods of the day. So potentially, could we get individuals to a job site earlier in the morning, start an hour earlier, let them leave an hour earlier at the end of the day, so that they have an opportunity to work when potentially temperatures aren't as high, or the sun is not at its peak. We also want to implement again that rest, water, and shade. We want to minimize activities in hot areas where we can, but also understand that that can't always happen. So in those situations where you have to continue working in that hot environment, one of the things we can do is slow down the work pace. We also want to reduce the number and duration of exposures. In some cases, people are going to work outside all day. There's nothing we can do about that. But if you have an environment where you can, reduce the traffic into a hotter environment, we want to try to do that. Additionally, there's proper clothing that can be wear that's going to be wicking, more breathable, considering clothing that has that SPF to, prevent potential sunburn or other things that make it harder. We don't want individuals potentially wearing wool in these types of environment, or heavy, thick clothing that isn't breathable. And then we also want to provide recovery areas for individuals to go make sure that they have access to that water, sit down, take a break if they aren't feeling great, and maybe add in those more frequent breaks. And again, when we talk about that work rate, what we do know is that one of the fastest ways to decrease the rate of heat production is to decrease the work rate if we're working in those indoor environments. As I mentioned, we also want to have the individual in charge of your program monitor the weather. So we're going to instruct supervisors to track the weather of the job site, or where your facility is located, by monitoring predicted temperature highs and periodically using a thermometer to determine what is going on at that job site or workplace. We also want to determine and instruct supervisors on how weather information will be used to modify work schedules, or increase the number of water and rest breaks, or even potentially cease work early if necessary. And this is something that should be explicitly spelled out in a heat prevention plan, just so that there is a clear line of communication about expectations from leadership to supervisors, managers, and employees. And again, the easiest way to monitor is going to be by going to the National Weather Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website. The last line of defense we always talk about is personal protective equipment. And that is because it's not able to always be used in every single environment. Sometimes it's hard to get access to, whether or not individuals and to wear it. All of these things are factors into that. So personal protective equipment can include things like reflective clothing, as well as auxiliary body cooling devices that we see pretty frequently, including ice vests, wetted clothing, or low humidity clothing, as well as water cooled garments. So this would be things like hoods, vests, or long johns that are out there, as well as circulating air. So these are going to be things like vortex tubes, or compressed air. Sometimes we can see air circulating in different types of like welding hoods or helmets that are out there. Pappers too can have some air circulating effects as well. But we really want to think about how do we get individuals cooled down. So again, providing hats that are going to cover the back of the neck. Sometimes you see the piece of fabric hanging off to shade the neck a little bit. Again, something that's maybe brimmed to hide the face and ears a little bit more. Additionally, I know that there is a newer hard hat insert that came out from one of the safety companies that basically you just get it wet in cool water and you place it in in the hard hat, and that actually helps lower the temperature by up to 30 degrees. So just different tools that are coming out that can be used for PPE. But again, if you have a heat prevention plan, these are things that you can address as an employer if you're going to offer them, or potentially even what you're going to allow employees to bring in, or if potentially you're allowing them to change what they wear on a day-to-day in those days that are extremely hot. So again, just something else to consider in that heat prevention plan you'll work on. One of the other areas we talk about is acclimatization for new workers. So becoming acclimatized to your environment is really important because statistically we know that the individuals that are most likely to suffer from heat-related illness or injury or have a heat-related fatality are actually newer workers to a job site, or individuals who haven't been acclimated or properly trained about heat-related injury and illness. And usually this happens within the first 2 to 3 days, but sometimes the first week of work is when we see individuals succumbing to heat-related illnesses, just because they're not prepared or acclimatized. And so on a 8-hour shift, we want to spend about an hour and a half in heat on that first day. So if we have a new worker, maybe have them go out to a job site or do something, or bring them into a facility, for that hour and a half to get them used to it. Maybe the other part of the day can be spent with HR, doing paperwork, doing training, getting them up to speed in other situations, but we want to slowly introduce them to the environment. And then that exposure time should increase slowly, but no more than 20% increase per day. But acclimatization does really depend on each person. So what works for one person may not work for someone else. Again, we don't know what causal factors are there or what they've been exposed to previously. So it could take between 7 to 14 days. There are additional resources that are out there on NIOSH's website about making sure workers are acclimatized. This is one of just kind of the quick graphics that they provided. And we also recognize that this is one of the hardest ones for businesses. Additionally, we want to reacclimatize experienced workers. So this isn't just for new workers, but experienced workers as well. So on an 8-hour shift, it could take, we want to spend about 4 days potentially acclimatizing if they've been out for an extended period of time. Maybe you had individuals out on worker leave, maybe they took an extended vacation. When we're experiencing that, we really want to try to shorten the amount of time that they're spending in the heat on that first day back. So 4 hours in heat on that first day, 4 to 4.5 hours on that second day, 6.5 hours on the third. And by the fourth day, most healthy workers should be able to tolerate 8 hours in the heat. But just something to think about, even our most experienced workers can succumb to if they're not used to the conditions or climates. So again, training your employees to recognize the signs and symptoms, but also having a plan written that kind of sets expectations for workers who have been away or new workers is really important, just to kind of set that standard across a job site or in a facility or within an organization. So OSHA's big thing that they say, NIOSH's big thing that they're putting out, and we've mentioned it so many times in this webinar already. If there's nothing more you take home, please take home this. We want to provide water, rest, and shade. So when we're talking about providing water, what do I mean? We want an adequate supply of potable water. What this means is potentially 2 to 4 cups per hour per worker. The best way I usually talk to employers about this is, if you're thinking about 2 cups, usually it's like one water bottle from Costco, like the ones you can recycle, 16 ounces. So that's really what we're encouraging individuals to drink. If you are providing potable water to workers, we want to make sure that water is not hot, but between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. We want a marked container. So we want it to say, drinking water. We want it to be a closed container so things or debris can't fall into it. And we don't want it to be a shared container. So we don't want like just 1 cup for the whole site that people are sharing back and forth. Instead, you can get some like the sports ones where they have the ability to fill up water bottles or different things like that. Um, but that's what you'll see here. Again, there's a lot of really great handouts on OSHA's website for you to put out, but that's one of the things you want to consider. Additionally, workers do need to drink that appropriate amount to stay hydrated. If your activities tend to be more moderate or heavier activities that last less than 2 hours, you could get away potentially, with 1 cup of water. Again, we're really encouraging, you know, every 20 to 30 minutes, you really want to be making sure you're hydrating, taking sips, even in a high activity environment. The higher the activity, the more exertion we're putting on the body, we want to increase that water level. If sweating lasts for several hours, we also want to potentially be providing things like sports drinks containing balanced electrolytes. So you could offer Gatorade or other electrolyte things. I know there's a lot of like liquid IV, again, not an endorsement, but liquid IV is out there. There's Noom tablets that you can pop in a water bottle. These are things you could offer to your workers so that they can replenish some of those electrolytes. Additionally, which I know it's always a hard one, but if we know it's going to be really, really hot, we want to, encourage our employees to try to avoid high caffeine or sugary beverages. So avoid soda, avoid coffee, high caffeine teas as well. The other thing to think about is, unfortunately, employers can't control what their employees do outside of work. But if you notice that you have a worker who's coming in who isn't feeling too hot because they had too much fun over the weekend, again, these types of things do put individuals at a greater risk when they're in those hot heat environments, if they weren't probably properly hydrated over the weekend. So other factors to think about. But one of the things to also consider is that we don't want to become overhydrated, which is also something that can happen, but really listen to your body, drink water accordingly, make sure that it's being offered, close to workers, that they don't have to travel far in order to take a drink. And again, there's a lot of really great handouts out there. When it comes to rest breaks, employers should ensure and encourage workers to take appropriate rest breaks to cool down and hydrate. If you have workers who are working outdoors, potentially staggering breaks a little bit more frequently throughout the day, allowing individuals to sit in an air conditioned vehicle, or if you have like a rally point for construction, have individuals sit in there. Depending what you're doing, again, we just want to add those in more frequently to the day and encourage workers to use them if they're starting to feel unwell for any specific reason. And again, we really want to modify those rest periods, and explaining or spelling that out in a plan, as we mentioned before, is going to be really helpful because it sets the standard of what the expectations are. But it also gives workers a chance to cool down, respond, get hydrated, to go back out to work to be the most effective that they can be. You can also assign new and individual workers who are getting acclimatized to lighter work, and you can offer them longer and more frequent breaks when we're trying to get them up to speed. We can also do shorter work periods and increase those rest breaks. So again, as temperature and humidity and sunshine increases throughout the day, maybe you're going to stagger in more breaks in the day. In the morning, maybe the ambient temperature isn't going to be that bad. So you're like normal day up until like 11 or noon, and then in the afternoon you're going to take those more frequent breaks. But put out that expectation of what you're allowing workers to do, and also let them know if they absolutely need a break, that they should take it, that their health and well-being is the most important thing. And then the other thing is, we want to shorten work periods for individuals who are doing heavier and more intense work, or who have that increased physiological burden placed on them by protective clothing or equipment, PPE, that's being worn. Shade is something that we also want to make sure we have enough of, that workers can take a break around and recover from the heat. So if you're outdoors, we've seen a lot of individuals getting those little pop-up kind of tailgate tents, if you will. that they can set up with some tables so workers can go sit in the shade. Again, those air-conditioned vehicles are nearby buildings, that portable tent. Adding in things like fans and misting devices is a really great way to cool people down. I've also heard work or employers talk about like offering like cool washcloths that have been like sitting in an ice bucket so that workers could come and cool themselves down that way. For indoor workers, they should be able to cool potentially in like an air conditioned break room, away from heat sources if it's like a bakery or something, or foundry like ovens and furnaces. So somewhere that they can actually start cooling themselves down. Work monitoring programs are also something you can include in a heat prevention plan, but also establish among your workplace. And this is really saying we have a system to monitor and report signs and symptoms in order to improve early detection and action. This is really when you have individuals who are working together, using a buddy system to assist supervisors when watching for signs of heat illness. So again, we often say we know our coworkers, especially if we work closely with them. So if you see someone not acting like themselves or maybe seem a little confused, or again, you start to see that rash, things like that, have you been drinking water? How are you feeling okay? Check in with one another, but also make sure that they know who to report um, situations to if you start to really get worried about a colleague. And again, one of the biggest things we know about heat related illness is that confusion is one of those signs we need to watch out for. And so again, that coworker may not realize where they're at, or how they're feeling because of that confusion. So again, something to be aware of. Personal monitoring can exist. So some people have like Apple Watches. Sometimes you'll see the heart rate spike, things like that. But also monitor yourself. Encourage employees to monitor their urine output. I know that's a weird thing to talk to people about, but if it's really yellow, if you're not able to go to the bathroom, things like that, that is something, you need to be taking in more water, doing more things. So training your employees on how to recognize, warning signs or early indicators that, hey, something might be going on. Again, we also need to include in a plan things like emergency planning and response. So we want to have an emergency plan in place that communicates what the expectations are of supervisors and workers. This emergency plan should include considerations like what to do if someone is showing those signs and symptoms of heat illness, and then having this explicitly stated, having workers trained, having supervisors in the know can make the difference between life and death. And that is why this is so important to really talk about these things, to train employees and to raise that awareness. But our bigger takeaways is we want to include how to contact emergency help for individuals who are maybe working in agriculture or responding to agriculture related calls. Sometimes you could be 20, it might be 20 to 30 minutes before help can get on site. So do we have a designated first responder or other individuals trained on what to do if all of a sudden you see someone collapse? What are we doing while we're waiting for that emergency help to arrive? Where's that first aid kit? Again, do we have shade or an air conditioned vehicle we can let a worker sit in until someone comes to get help? Same with construction. Again, we want to train workers on appropriate first aid measures until that help can arrive. And we want to consider seeking advice as well from either healthcare professionals that we're contracted with, maybe your insurance carrier provider. In helping prepare a plan, you can also contact, if you have a health and safety team within your own organization or facility, or if you need help, you can always reach out to us at the State Laboratory of Hygiene, the WisCon team. We're happy to, talk to you about heat illness prevention planning and what expectations are in different scenarios. So always feel free to reach out to us as well. But having these plans in place, one, just sets that standard of safety, really protects workers, and communicates that that is your priority. This is just as an example of a first aid first aid handout that was out there. I believe this one's from NIOSH. Just again, first aid for heat illness. This is something you could use in a training. It's something you could post on a job site. when to seek immediate medical attention. It talks about it, call 911, cool the worker down, stay with the worker until help arrives. That's why also working a buddy system is really important, especially on those high heat days. And then what to watch for other signs and symptoms. And then when in doubt, call 911. So again, really good handouts and information that are out there. A lot of these are in multiple languages that can be printed out. So these aren't just in English, these are offered in Spanish. I believe Hmong is one that it's offered in as well, but go to NIOSH's website, go to OSHA's website and download some of these handouts that are in a multitude of languages. As far as training goes, I know we've talked about it throughout this presentation, but our big takeaways for employees is we need them to know that these hazards do exist and what the hazards are, as well as those predisposing factors. We talked about age, medication, health conditions, previous exposure. We also want them to be aware of the signs and symptoms and then the importance of reporting them, as well as different PPE solutions, again, maybe different types of clothing that they're allowed to wear on those higher heat days, and then first aid and how to respond if they notice that a coworker or someone has a heat-related illness, either themselves or a coworker, as well as the health effects of heat-related illness and the long-term complications that can arise if it's not taken seriously. And we also want to talk to them about becoming acclimatized to the environments that they're working in. There are some training links available. You have the OSHA info sheet. Again, if you just go to OSHA's website, we drop the links in the chat for heat. You can have access to that as well as the OSHA training guide for employers. But again, we know that it's easier to plan and prepare and work to prevent things than responding when we have individuals who don't know how to respond. So we have a little time left. I'm going to try to cover this really quick, but I think it's important to talk about some case studies of situations that have come out or that OSHA has been called out for and what they've seen as far as heat-related illnesses and injuries. So our case study number one is for a roofing worker. In July of last year, a 42-year-old man started a new job as a roofer. His employer did not have a formal plan to protect new workers from heat-related illness, although there was plentiful water, ice, and Gatorade available at the site. The worker felt fine during his first 2 days of work. His third day on the job was slightly warmer with a high temperature of about 86 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity of 57% for a heat index of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. In the afternoon, the worker told his coworker he felt hot and sick. He climbed down from the roof and went to sit by himself in the sun. There wasn't shade. When his coworker checked on him a few minutes later, he had symptoms of heat stroke. He was taken to the hospital where he later died. Scattered clouds may have reduced the radiant temperature somewhat, but reconstruction showed a web bulb globe temperature of 82 degrees Fahrenheit based on the data of a nearby airport. So again, you know, what could we do or what could we learn from this case? One, we need to protect new workers. We need to talk about acclimatization plans because we know that new workers during their first 2 weeks are the most vulnerable when they're not used to either pace of work environment, and climate. We need to be making sure that workers are taking frequent breaks to hydrate. We never want to leave workers alone if they start to show symptoms of heat-related illness. We want to make sure that they have a buddy with them. We want to move them to a cool area and provide immediate aid. We also want to make sure that they're in the shade, they're not sitting out in the sun. And the biggest takeaway that we know is heat stroke can occur even in temperatures in the 80s due to a combined factor of heat and workload stress. Case number two is a delivery worker. So a 50-year-old man had been working at a delivery company for 6 years. His job involved driving a vehicle and walking in residential neighborhoods to deliver mail and packages. In late May, the weather suddenly became hotter. On the second day of hot weather, this worker developed heat-related cramps and heat exhaustion. He was hospitalized for 2 days with acute kidney failure due to dehydration. His condition improved after intravenous fluid replacement. Lessons learned from this case. is that even experienced workers are vulnerable to heat-related illness when the weather becomes warmer or if there's a sudden change in temperature. Throughout the first week of warmer conditions, again, we want to make sure that all workers are treated as if they need to learn to adapt to those new working environments from the heat. And that's when we want to encourage those extra precautions to protect them from that heat-related illness. And again, we want to make sure workers are taking breaks, staying hydrated, especially during that warmer hot weather. We're going to skip through that third case study just to leave time for questions. What is our bottom line and takeaway is that excessive heat in a work environment can lead to serious physical harm and or death. The keys are recognition of the hazards that exist in the workplace and then taking action and providing preventative measures to reduce that risk or likelihood of heat related illness. Again, here you can see one of the other handouts, ease into work, prevent heat illness. Again, these are great to put out at a work site, include in a training. So what can you do to help? Or what can we do? So we want to develop and implement that heat illness prevention and heat acclimatization programs for the workplace. We want to ensure employees have access to adequate supplies of potable water. We want to provide a means for employees to cool off shaded areas, air-conditioned rooms, vehicles, fans. We also want to provide an adequate number of rest periods or increase rest periods as weather changes. We want to provide appropriate PPE or things like cooling vests if that's something that can happen at your facility, organization, or job site. We want to make sure that our workers are properly trained on heat stress. And then we also want to include elements of first aid training, so recognition and treatment of heat illness while we're waiting for first responders to come on site. And then we want to review for those who are in private industry, we want to review OSHA's NEP for heat related or heat stress guidance. Questions?
So hi, Kelly, we received a couple questions in the box, and one of them is asking if you could elaborate on what kinds of PPE actually increase the risk of heat-related illness.
So one of the things we're thinking about when we're thinking about things that could place additional burden. So if you are someone who wears respiratory protection on a regular basis, if it, for example, is like a full face respirator, we know that traditionally that can place an increased physiological burden on the body. So adding in a increase in effort exerted during work, throwing in heat to it, and then having to take that off potentially and put it back on every time you need to take a sip of water. Sometimes workers won't take those adequate breaks because they don't want to take it off and then put it back on. So watching workers like that and understanding that can place an increased physiological burden on the body. If you are someone who is wearing heavy uh, equipment or PPE. So maybe you're an electrician who's out there, who's working on a job site, and you have to wear your arc flash gear when working outside on a generator or something. That is going to be a suit that you're going to, put on a hard hat, face shield, gloves. Not super breathable will of course protect you from, an arc flash, but some of that bulky material or those full suits that individuals work or use for a variety of different jobs or tasks, that's going to, not be super breathable. Again, be warmer on the environment depending how long you're working. You might be sweating more. So just things to think about that way as far as PPE that could make things worse. Welders, again, wear welding jackets. A lot of those are leather based. And so again, just it can get really hot in there. Other professionals, your firefighters are individuals responding to fires, especially volunteer departments. Again, there's just a lot of different situations where people are using PPE to protect themselves from the hazards that are out there, but the heat can also make that harder.
Right, thank you. We have another one. Underlying medical conditions can aid in causing heat stroke. As an employer, you want to know about those conditions with a new employee, but HIPAA can stop that from happening. How would you go about in a situation like this?
I think the best thing you can do is especially when it becomes increasingly warmer or it's going to be a really hot week, is you could always send out a reminder to employees that if they do have an underlying medical condition and they want to talk to a provider about it, because working in the heat could put them at an increased risk, to potentially provide a doctor's note. Maybe you could consider job reassignment if that individual has a really severe potential risk out there. One of the times we see that is if you have pregnant workers, and it's going to be really, really hot out. Again, that increased physiological burden, potentially having a physician write a note saying, hey, let's move that person inside. If you have a worker who has had previous heat-related illness at your job site or in your workplace, and it's going to be hotter out, that's documented on your OSHA 300 logs. It was a potential recordable for those individuals. Maybe you'll want to transition them out of something, but really just being proactive as an employer, encouraging that trust building to say, hey, we recognize that this can place a risk if you're someone who has an underlying medical condition that can increase the burden on the body or increase your risk or sensitivity. Please let us know. Please make us aware. Also understanding that employers might not feel comfortable to do so, and that's really tough. I absolutely get what you're saying, but encouraging those open lines of communication, I think, is the best way to go about it. But again, at the end of the day, that's ultimately up to the employee. And I know that can be really difficult um, if they want to share that or not. I don't know if Anne or Tasha, you have anything else you want to answer to that.
No, I do not. We don't have any other questions.
Perfect. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, now afternoon, 12:02, for this webinar. Again, if you do have questions, please reach out to our team at the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene, WisCon. We're really happy to help answer questions that you have. If you need help or assistance in the future, just know you're not alone. This is something so many organizations and establishments are actively working on. So we just want to make sure you have the information you need to be proactive. If you work at a local tribal health department and helping individuals in your community, hopefully you can use these resources to educate them. And if you're an employer, hopefully you have something to take back to be able to bolster your own program. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate your time.